So maybe someday, maybe 10 years later, I'll make another episode where I would be happy to say that Royal Enfield is one of the best motorcycle brands in the world in terms of their looks, but more importantly in terms of their quality of cycle parts and reliability. And invariably what you'll find that day is that India would have progressed in real terms at a level that they can talk about themselves in equal terms as the foreign cultures and civilizations and the Western world primarily. So I look forward to that day, 10 years from now, that I can be brutally honest and say that India has arrived. Hello friends, namaskar dosto. Today I'm going to switch to English for this particular episode, and that is primarily because I believe that the topic for today actually relates to the entire world. So a lot of viewers from all over the world would probably be interested in understanding this unique phenomena, not just the domestic audience. And that's the only reason for my switch. I will continue to make videos in Hindi in the future, let me assure my current viewers. It's pretty unique, isn't it? Royal Enfield as a motorcycle brand. I think it sounds today, when you talk about Royal Enfield, people talk about India. It's a quintessential British brand, you know, that started its life as a British brand. And somehow today, when you look at Royal Enfield all over the world, it embodies the Indian culture, the Indian masculinity. Indian men say something about the Indian men to the entire world. The reason that I talk about the entire world is because Royal Enfields are getting more and more popular all over the world. I have been seeing Royal Enfields pretty regularly in foreign roads and for a long time. Some of their models, for example, the twin cylinder models that they came up a few years ago, have been really popular in Western shores because I believe that they are fast enough to be driven or to be ridden on Western freeways or highways. So it is turning out to be a global brand and an Indian ambassador, because you don't have too many Indian brands that carry that Indianness to foreign shores, and that is something that is to be celebrated about Royal Enfield. I think it's a great brand. So how does this quintessential Western origin brand become quintessentially Indian in a period of maybe 70, 80 years, 90 years? And how does it relate to the Indian manliness, masculinity, machismo of Indian men? To understand that, we have to delve a little bit into, you know, what constitutes the Indian men and the psyche of the Indian men that has evolved into what it is over a period of, you know, maybe 1,000 years. India, as you know, has been under foreign occupation and invasion and subjugation for the last 1,200 years. And all of that has had an impact on the Indian psyche, especially the psyche of Indian men, because foreign occupation and slavery and subjugation has a different impact on men compared to its impact on women. Don't get me wrong, Indian women have been at the receiving end of brutal occupation and slavery, right? Starting from subjugation and sexual slavery, sold in batches, large batches, to all these prostitution houses all over Asia and even in North Africa. In fact, there are some small towns in Central Asia and in Afghanistan which are exclusively known by their reputation for selling large number of Indian women through all these trade routes. Especially Afghanistan, I think they have a place that is known for selling Indian women. So that was pretty brutal, unimaginable in this age and period, but it had a different effect on the Indian male. What Indian men, able-bodied men, had to deal with was equally atrocious. Large number of them were killed in cold blood because they were of no use to the invaders. The young boys probably survived, but they were deprived of their culture. They were brought up as slaves and in subservient positions in the society. The families that were not close to power, that survived all these foreign invasions and slavery, took very subservient roles in the society. They would take on roles that would not be threatening to the invaders or the new masters. Something like clerical jobs, for example, was popular with Indians during foreign invasions, both during the Mughal period and the Delhi Sultanate period before that, and also during the British period. One of the reasons that these clerical or similar roles, one of the reasons they were popular with Indians was because they were very non-threatening. Plus, the rulers knew that they could take things away if they were not pleased with their performance. So broadly speaking, Indian males had to take on roles that were subservient and also effeminate by nature. Sounds pretty crude, but that's the fact of living under a brutal, oppressive regime. And that too for a long period of time. 1,000 years is a very long time for a large civilization to live under slavery and occupation. Most of the civilizations similar to India that went through foreign subjugation for a long period usually lost their culture totally. Look at the Egyptians, look at the Iranians, look at other parts of the world that have totally lost touch with their paternal cultures because of the long period of foreign invasion. But not India, not Indians. There must be some secret to that. One of the secret was that the Indian male or the Indian manliness was probably wise enough to bend rather than break in face of foreign invasion and enslavement. And one of the ways that they bend themselves to survive those long periods of brutality was to bend and take on these sort of effeminate roles that served them well. So for 1,000 years, the Delhi Sultanate, Central Asian rule, Mughal rule, then the British, the Indian male was taking up small niches in the society that were non-threatening, right? They had to put aside their natural instincts of manliness. But everything started to change during the later period of the British rule, especially from the 1920s, 30s onwards. Prior to this period, the British manliness was totally dominant over the Indian variety or the Indian manliness. And the reason for that was, massive victories in battle that totally belittled the Indian culture and civilization. Think about the Battle of Plassey that took place in Bengal, where the British soldiers, I think they had a contingent of 37,000 soldiers, and most of them were sepoys of Indian origin. Only a few thousand were probably of British origin, or maybe a few hundred. And somehow they defeated the forces of the local Nawab that numbered 57,000. So just think about it, 3,700 men with only a few hundred British, and rest of them local sepoys, were able to defeat an army of 57,000 local soldiers of the Nawab. What demoralizing effect does it have on the Indian psyche? So they were pretty used to it by the 1900s and in the early 20th century, but things started to change. You know what they used to say back in those days? The Tommy, or a common English soldier, or a red coat. The image was that a Tommy with his chest bare would hold a gun in his hand, and not a single Indian man would dare come in front of him. Such was the bravery and the terror in the minds of Indians under foreign rule. We don't have records of the Mughal period or the Delhi Sultanate period because they were more antiquated, but chances are that it was pretty similar. So what changed in the 1920s and 30s was the rise of nationalism in India, in some parts of India. Think about Bengal and Punjab, and in the western parts of India, there rose a militant struggle for independence. And with that militant struggle for independence, there was a reawakening of the Indian manliness, of that spirit that was subservient and enslaved for 1,000 years. So like a phoenix, it went up, it came up and started reconstituting itself. And what it did at that period of time was it took on convenient things that it could latch onto for that new identity to be forged. An easy example is cricket, a team sport. A team sport is always similar to a war. It's a role in entertainment that derives from the ancient battles and wars, right? So cricket was a team sport that the Indian public very conveniently latched onto from their foreign masters to constitute their new identity. And that's exactly what happened with motorcycles and Royal Enfield, to be exact. The Indian men latched onto that rugged charm of the Royal Enfield motorcycles that was British in origin but was readily available in India and convenient. It had that rugged charm, that good look, that lazy vibe about it. It had that lazy exhaust note which told the world once you were riding on it, it told the world that you didn't care about what other people thought, because it had that lazy note you could do at your own pace. You can do things at your own pace. So the Indian public fell in love with it. There were other aspects to it as well. For example, when the new nation of India came into being, it didn't have too many options in terms of other motorcycle brands. So one angle was that of necessity, and the other angle was that of the charm and the lovability of that motorcycle and that ruggedness. So the Indian public took to it and made it their own in the next 50 or 60 years. When the liberalization started to come in the 80s, you had a swath of foreign brands that came into the market that sold motorcycles, more efficient motorcycles. For example, Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, Kawasaki. They were really efficient, really good motorcycles, much better than the Royal Enfields in every tangible way. But what it didn't have was that intangible manliness that was entwined with the Indian culture that Royal Enfield embodied. So as the Japanese brands of motorcycles took over the mass market, Royal Enfield was left with that segment of the mass market that was slightly above, but was not as expensive as, let's say, foreign imported brands or foreign imported motorcycles. So it filled that small segment of the market that was above the mass market motorcycles like RX100 or CB100. All the people from the 80s and 90s would know what I'm talking about. The Yamaha RX100 was an iconic motorcycle. The Honda CB100 was a legend, and it sort of continues to this day with the Hero Honda Splendor or the Hero Splendor today. But it never really took over that small segment that was slightly above it, which Royal Enfield captured. And that segment was slightly below the imported motorcycles, because as you know, imported motorcycles were very, very expensive back in those days. So people who couldn't afford these imported motorcycles but didn't want to go with a mass market motorcycle usually went for the Royal Enfield. But at that period of time in the 90s, it was a pretty small segment. But what changed for Royal Enfield was that segment of motorcycle owners grew over time. And in the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, now that segment has grown exponentially, and it's a large market. And that's the reason all these foreign brands are now trying to corner Royal Enfield to capture that market share or part of that market share. But let's come back to our topic. How does Royal Enfield embody the Indian man of today? We have talked about what the Indian man was subjected to in history, how it came out of its own shell in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, how it found its identity with Royal Enfield in the 1950s, and fast forward until today. It's just as strong, if not stronger. And what it has achieved in doing is export that Indian brand of manliness to Western shores or to foreign lands. Royal Enfields today are very common on foreign roads, and it sort of embodies their Indian spirit, Indian manly spirit. It's taken it global, which is really admirable. But one thing that does need to be addressed about Indian manliness, I know that we are living through a period where we're seeing a lot of chest thumping, of Indianness, of Indian manliness. And Royal Enfield is probably a part of that as well. Maybe indirectly, if not directly, but it is probably part of that same discourse. And there are some things that are probably a little bit grey and not entirely positive about it. When a new narrative is built around manliness, the spirit of invincibility that obviously has to be built with a resurgence of a culture. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's natural. Every nation which rises up creates its own values. It sometimes is exaggerated. Look at China. If you go to the mainstream Chinese culture, you can see a lot of fallacies that are being circulated by the state to create that national narrative. So it's pretty normal, and what's happening in India is pretty natural. But what I'm saying is, we need to be honest about it and at least know ourselves, even if we don't tell it to the entire world, that not all of it is true. And how do we explain it, or how do we actually show it, display it? Let's come back to the Royal Enfield brand then. It's the perfect candidate for us to show how the Indian male stands in the world right now. So what is Royal Enfield motorcycles today? Most of the motorcycles are 350cc single-cylinder motorcycles. Reality check. In Western countries or in foreign lands, it's usually ladies or girls who would even think about 350cc motorcycles. That too, not as underpowered as most Royal Enfield motorcycles, which are terribly underpowered. Pretty crude. They would vibrate at a massive level if you take them over 70 or 80 kilometers per hour, which are not sufficient to be ridden on modern highways. What Royal Enfield has done well is to bring up their twin-cylinder motorcycles like the Royal Enfield Interceptor 650 and Continental GT 650 and a few other derivatives. They've got a 650cc twin-cylinder engine which is more, adapted or more suitable for Western style of riding, especially if you want to go into the freeways or the highways. It can at least keep up. A lot of people in Western countries usually say that it's still too slow. The 650cc twin-cylinder Royal Enfields are still too slow. They say that it's as slow as a dog and it's too heavy. But still, it's sellable, it's selling in large numbers, it's visible, and that shows that it's successful at a certain level. But it still doesn't hide the fact that the Indian motorcycle or the Indian psyche is still a long way behind the Western world. It is, after all, a poor quality motorcycle in terms of the quality of the cycle parts. It's made from cheap category of metal or cheap quality of metal that rusts easily, breaks easily. It's not as durable, it's not as reliable, and doesn't sound similar to how the Indian built military equipment is also faring in the battlefield. Look at all those Insas rifles, they're not doing that well. Look at all those military tanks, army tanks that are built by India domestically. They're not up to the scratch. So all I'm saying is that it shows to the world that India is rising, is moving in the right direction. It's exporting its culture and its values and its manliness to the Western shores and around the world, but it still has a long way to go. So maybe someday, maybe 10 years later, I'll make another episode where I would be happy to say that Royal Enfield is one of the best motorcycle brands in the world in terms of their looks, but more importantly in terms of their quality of cycle parts and reliability. And invariably what you'll find that day is that India would have progressed in real terms at a level that they can talk about themselves in equal terms as the foreign cultures and civilizations and the Western world primarily. So I look forward to that day, 10 years from now, that I can be brutally honest and say that India has arrived. We are going in the right direction, but we haven't reached there yet. And that's what Royal Enfield of today tells to the entire world about a rising India. Tell me in the comment section what you feel about my line of thought in this direction. If you don't agree to it, do put it down in the comments. I'll be happy to reply to you. And keep watching my videos in future. I'll see you in my next video. Till then, Thank you.